There's an interesting discussion on the question of the atonement. And if somebody offered an animal sacrifice after the crucifixion and after embracing the atonement of Jesus on the cross, some would say that's an act of apostasy. If that's true, then we have to examine the situation with the Apostle Paul. So I want to take a look at what the Apostle Paul did in the book of Acts and whether or not he offered a sacrifice of atonement after the crucifixion, after embracing Jesus' atoning work. Did he offer an animal sacrifice? And whether or not this was necessarily an act of apostasy in light of what the Council of Florence says on this particular issue. Because again, some people are going to automatically assert, well, this is a denial either of the atonement of Jesus on the cross or it's an act of apostasy. So let me go ahead and share my screen and we're going to take a look at this together. I want to go over Acts chapter 21, verses 17 on down. Let's read that whole pericope. Okay. So you should be able to see it on your screen right around now. So it notes, when we had come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. After greeting them, he related one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified God and said to him, "You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed." It continues, "They are all zealous for the law, and they have been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses." So you see the accusation that they're making about Paul is that Paul is telling Jews to forsake the law of Moses. Now, did Jesus say to forsake the law of Moses? He says, "No, I come not to abolish, but to fulfill." So then the question is, was Paul going against that? Was he telling people to forsake the law of Moses that included animal sacrifices? This is obviously after the crucifixion, after the resurrection, about 25 years after. So that's the accusation that they're leveling against him, telling them not to circumcise their children or to observe the customs. So we already know that Paul was telling Gentiles they don't have to get circumcised or observe the customs. And that was also confirmed previously in the 15th chapter of the same book, Acts. But the question then is, what about Jews, though? Like Jewish Christians, people who are Jews who convert to Christianity, do they still keep the law? Do they still observe circumcision and the other customs? This would include the temple sacrifices, because the temple was still going until it was destroyed in 70 AD. It was still up. So what about Jews who converted to Christianity? Is he telling them abandon the law of Moses? Don't observe circumcision? Don't observe the Sabbath? Don't observe the temple rituals? Well, that was the accusation that they're making against him. So watch what happens. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come. Do therefore what we tell you. So they tell Paul, here's what you need to do to address this accusation against you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. This is a Nazirite vow. We'll take a look at what that is here in a moment in number 6. Take these men, purify yourself along with them. So you're going to take the vow. You're going to go through this ritual. And you're going to pay for their undergoing of this purification rite. Take these men and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads. Thus, all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself live in observance of the law. So go and do this, go and partake yourself in this purification rite, and pay for them to do it too. And that way, people who are saying that you're telling people not to follow the law of Moses, you're telling Jews not to follow those customs, they'll stop saying it, because it's clear that you do follow the law of Moses even after embracing Christianity. But as for the Gentiles who have believed, we have sent a letter with our judgment, that's Acts 15, that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, by the way, and it says, and from blood. So don't eat meat with blood in it. The Council of Florence reversed this apostolic decision. So here's a case where an ecumenical council reverses what the apostles judged. Not the first time we've seen that. We've seen that also with communion under one kind, as opposed to under two kinds, which was the apostolic practice. Okay, so, and from blood, and from what is strangled, and from unchastity. That's what the Gentiles who embrace Jesus, they need to follow those laws. But the Jews who embrace Christianity, this is saying, they need to observe the law of Moses. So it says, then Paul took them in, and did he say, guys, don't do this. You're no longer under Moses, no longer under that law. You're under the law of Christ. Did he do that? No. Then Paul took them in, and the next day he purified himself. So he takes on this Nazirite vow from the book of Numbers, from the law of Moses, purified himself, and with them went into the temple to give notice when the days of purification would be fulfilled, and the offering presented for every one of them. What is this offering? This included not only an offering of hair, but also animal sacrifices. So Paul goes into the temple and says, here's when we're going to offer these animal sacrifices. How do we know that? Well, we know what the Nazirite vow in the book of Numbers entails. We'll take a look at it in just a second. But examine this commentary from the Ignatius Study Bible, Ignatius Catholic Study Bible, that effectively confirms what I've just said. It says, in regards to forsake Moses, rumors had reached Jerusalem that Paul forbade Jewish Christians to observe the religious traditions of Judaism. James takes this report to be false and urges Paul to make a public display of his reverence for the customs of Moses. From the perspective of Acts, only the Gentiles were exempt from circumcision and other ceremonies of the Torah. So only Gentiles who convert to Christianity were exempt from the law of Moses. Jewish Christians were not exempt. And it says, although hints are given that the temple and its Mosaic rituals will pass away, even for the Jews in due time. According to the Council of Florence in 1442, and other rites of the Mosaic law, they could still be observed in the earliest days of the church. So that included animal sacrifices, so long as no one considered them necessary requirements for salvation. We'll actually take a look at what the Council of Florence says here in a moment. But the Council of Florence is confirming that, yes, during this period of time, Jewish Christians could offer animal sacrifices even after the crucifixion and even after embracing the atoning work of Jesus. Concerning the words under a vow, it says, a temporary Nazirite vow of abstinence from wine, cutting the hair, and physical contact with corpses. The completion of the vow involved a week of purification, a ritual shaving of the head, and a sacrificial offering of animals and food in the temple. So you do have animal sacrifices that are involved in the taking of the Nazirite vow, in the completion of the Nazirite vow. An offering of food and animals in the temple. Paul had completed a similar vow in Acts 18:18. So it's confirming Paul participated in these animal sacrifices. Now, If you look at Numbers 6, that describes this vow, this Nazirite vow, it's explicitly clear that there are animal sacrifices involved. So here's what Paul just told the temple he's going to do. And this is the law for the Nazirite. When the time of his separation had been completed, he shall be brought to the door of the tent of meeting, and he shall offer his gift to the Lord, one male lamb, so very clearly an animal sacrifice, a year old without blemish for a burnt offering, one lamb a year old without blemish as a sin offering. Listen to that. So Paul is still offering sin offerings even after the atoning work of Jesus on the cross. Let that sink in. Let that sink in. It says a year old without blemish as a sin offering, and one ram without blemish as a peace offering, and a basket of unleavened bread, cakes of fine flour mixed with oil, and unleavened wafers spread with oil, and their cereal offering, and their drink offering. So there's a lot of offerings here. And the priest shall present them before the Lord and offer his sin offering and his burnt offering. And then he shall offer the ram as a sacrifice of peace offerings to the Lord with a basket of unleavened bread. The priest shall offer also its cereal offerings and its drink offerings. And the Nazirite shall shave his consecrated head at the door of the tent of meeting, and shall take the hair from his consecrated head and put it on the fire, which is under the sacrifice of the peace offering. So there's also an offering of the hair. And the priest shall take the shoulder of the ram when it is boiled, and one unleavened cake out of the basket, and one unleavened wafer, and shall put them upon the hands of the Nazirite after he has shaven the hair of his consecration. And the priest shall wave them for a wave offering before the Lord. They are a holy portion for the priest, together with the breast that is waved and the thigh that is offered. And after that, the Nazirite may drink wine. This is law for the Nazirite who takes a vow as offering to the Lord, shall be according to his vow as a Nazirite, apart from what else he can afford, in accordance with the vow which he takes. So shall he do according to the law for his separation as a Nazirite. The Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron and his sons, thus shall you bless the people of Israel, shall you say to them. And then here you have the Aaronic blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you, and so on. Okay. Very clear, very explicitly, the Apostle Paul, to put to rest those who are saying he doesn't practice circumcision or ritual purification and temple sacrifices and the law of Moses, the keeping of the Sabbath, to put to rest those who accuse him of that. He goes ahead and participates in this Nazirite vow, includes animal sacrifices. Again, this is after embracing the crucifixion and the atoning work of Jesus. Now, here's what the Council of Florence says on the matter. Oh, well, before we get to the Council of Florence, one more thing. Let me show you one more, just a nail in the coffin here. This is Acts 25, where he's being brought on trial, and people are saying that, he's violating the law, going against the customs. Well, watch what it says. Paul said in his defense, neither against the law of the Jews nor against the temple. So he's not even going against the temple and its sacrifices, nor against Caesar have I offended at all. So people are trying to accuse him, but he's saying, no. I haven't gone against the law of Moses or against the temple. And again, we know that's true because just several chapters prior to that, it tells us explicitly, 5 chapters prior to that, he's participating in these animal sacrifices at the temple. Post-conversion. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and be tried there on these charges before me? And so it was clear they could not actually pin him down and say, well, you see, he's actually going against the law of Moses. They couldn't do it because he himself is saying otherwise and has shown otherwise. Okay, so let's also take a look at the Council of Florence. I think this is the bull with the Copts, if I'm not mistaken, the reunion bull with the Copts. It firmly believes, professes, and teaches. This is an ecumenical council speaking, so notice the solemn language here. Firmly believes, professes, teaches that the legal prescriptions of the Old Testament or the Mosaic Law, which are divided into ceremonies, holy sacrifices, and sacraments, like circumcision. This is the way they spoke of circumcision. They called it a sacrament, but they recognized the difference between it and the New Covenant. Because they were instituted to signify something in the future, although they were adequate for the divine cult of that age, once our Lord Jesus Christ, who was signified by them, had come, came to an end, and the sacraments of the New Testament had their beginning. Whoever after the passion, so after the crucifixion, places his hope in the legal prescriptions and submits himself to them as necessary for salvation, as if faith in Christ without them could not save, sins mortally. So if after the crucifixion, a Jewish Christian goes and offers sacrifices in the temple, thinking that they need to do that for their salvation, Florence says you can't be saved. But it's not saying, but they couldn't do it as long as they thought that it wasn't necessary for their salvation. It's not saying that. It's just saying if they did do this and they thought it was necessary, then they sin mortally. It's not entirely saying they can't do it at all. It does not deny that from Christ's passion until the promulgation of the gospel, they could have retained, provided they were in no way believed to be necessary for salvation. So it explicitly says, after the crucifixion, but before the promulgation of the gospel goes out to all the world, you did have a time period where Jewish Christians could observe the law of Moses, the sacrifices, the animal sacrifices, all of that. As long as they didn't believe it was necessary for salvation, they could and, in fact, should observe the law according to the Council of Trent and according to the New Testament. By the way, this was a huge debate between Augustine and Jerome. They went back and forth because they disagreed on this point. But it says, but it asserts that after the promulgation of the gospel, they cannot be observed without loss of eternal salvation. So it wants to say, after the promulgation of the gospel, you can't do this at all, period, end of story. Whether you think it's necessary for salvation or not, you can't do it. So Florence is saying, you can't observe any of these things from the Old Testament. That includes the Passover, that includes circumcision, that includes temple sacrifices, which obviously you can't do anyway because there isn't a temple, but if it's somehow brought back, you still couldn't do it, even if you think it's necessary for salvation. Florence is saying you can't do that, period. You can't do it at all after the promulgation of the gospel, which has clearly already happened, right? But it asserts that after the promulgation of the gospel, they cannot be observed without loss of eternal salvation. So it says you're going to lose your salvation if you do this. Now, there's a difficulty here. There's some pope-splaining needed because a later pope came back and kind of said, well, you can in some cases be circumcised. In these rare cases, you could be circumcised. Florence is just outright, no, you can't do it at all. Another pope comes back and a little bit later says, well, maybe in some cases. And even now in the Catholic Church in the post-conciliar period, you'll see, cardinals like Cardinal Burke giving complete approval to Jewish Christians observing the Passover and stuff like that. So there's a difficulty here with what we see with some of the popes, not even in the post-conciliar period, but just after Florence, and also in the post-conciliar period, and what the Council of Florence is saying. So there's an element of Bible-splaining here and also pope-splaining. Okay. But it continues. Therefore, it denounces all who after that time observe circumcision, the Sabbath, and other legal prescriptions as strangers to the faith of Christ and unable to share in eternal salvation unless they recoil at some time from these errors. So it's saying you're going to be damned for all eternity if you do this, even if you don't think it's necessary for salvation. It says, therefore, it strictly orders all who glory in the name of Christian not to practice circumcision, either before or after baptism, since whether or not they place their hope in it. So whether you think it's salvific or not, it cannot possibly be observed without loss of eternal salvation. Again, there's some tension here with what some later popes have said, and even with some of the practices currently in the church on this particular point. That's a whole nother show, but it's something worth pointing out. In fact, I have done some shows on that, I think, already. But just pointing out the tension here. You have this taking place all the time. You read through the ecumenical councils, you'll find all sorts of tensions like this all throughout church history. But the point here is to especially address the issue where it concedes. During the time prior to the promulgation of the gospel, however, after the crucifixion, you could have Jewish Christians observing the law, observing the animal sacrifices, as long as they didn't believe that it was necessary for salvation. And that's clearly what's going on with the book of Acts in Acts chapter 20. So for those who say, well, to do this is necessarily an act of apostasy or necessarily a denial of the atonement, no, not exactly, because the Council of Florence wants to say, well, as long as you weren't, doing it for salvation, yes, it could be done during this time period. That's the way Florence attempts to reconcile and resolve this tension here. By the way, Florence is the same council in the same document that reverses the apostolic decision that Gentiles cannot eat meat with blood in it. Florence reverses it and says now they can. And it recognizes this was an apostolic decision in Acts 15 by the Council of Jerusalem, but we're going to go ahead and reverse that for various reasons. Again, not the first time we've seen the church do this. We saw this also with the Council of Constance, openly admitting it's reversing the practice of Jesus and the practice of the apostles of administering communion under both kinds. Constance says, yes, that's an apostolic practice, but we are going to restrict it to one kind for various reasons. Now, we know the Second Vatican Council has reversed that. So it reversed the reversal and went back to the apostolic practice. So here's actually a case where Vatican II is in more continuity with an apostolic practice than some of the other previous ecumenical councils. So as you can see, things are kind of messy, right? There's a lot of interesting things that take place throughout church history and in scripture, and also again in 2,000 years of church history, especially when you look at the ecumenical councils, and they're worth exploring. But be aware that this kind of stuff is going on, because I actually heard this come up, especially with the question of animal sacrifices, very recently in a discussion between a Muslim and a Christian, and it was being asserted that the fact that Paul performed these animal sacrifices was a clear evidence that he didn't believe in the atoning work of Jesus. And I want to say, well, no, not necessarily, not necessarily, because Florence offers this as a solution that I think is reasonable. So you don't have to immediately go to the position that somehow Paul was denying the atonement or something like that. No, I think that the burden of proof then is on that person to demonstrate that, because there is a way to harmonize these things. There's a way to Bible explain it. So Mihovel says, I know for the fact that Eastern Orthodox eat blood in, for example, blood sausages. How did they explain that, since they reject the Council of Florence? You're not going to find necessarily any kind of consistent explanation here, because there hasn't been any kind of definitive judgment for the Orthodox on the matter. So, all right. Well, I appreciate y'all, sending that super chat. I see some kind words here. Great stream. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. Nikki says, because we can eat blood now. That's funny. Nikki says Jews can't eat blood. According to Florence, if a Jewish person converts to Christianity, they cannot observe anything there from the Torah, according to Florence. Yet, that does not appear to be the position that the Catholic Church currently takes. So there seems to be some kind of implicit reversal of the Council of Florence on that particular point. All right, Sergeant says, thank you, Michael. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you all for watching. I hope this was helpful. Everybody hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. And of course, check me out at patreon.com/reason and theology if you want to support the channel. See you soon. Hey, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, the like button. And if you want to support the channel, visit patreon.com/reason and theology.